Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of TriVersity Talk. I am Stephen Bloomer Teague.
And I am Wendy Stewart Kaplan, and we're really happy to see you here at 7 o'clock on Sunday night. We have a terrific guest tonight.
Absolutely. But before we introduce him, we'll do our usual spiel.
It's like a commercial.
Indeed. Whether you're watching us on Facebook or YouTube, please give us a like or a love or a thumbs up. And if you could give us a subscribe or a follow, we'd really appreciate that too. That allows us to spread this show and get the word out more, and we can teach more people. And on the front of teaching,
yes,
we have a quite spectacular teacher on today.
He really is. He was the trailblazer for LGBTQ History Month. That's right. He started it all. And in 1994, he answered the question, do gay teachers belong in the classroom?
Absolutely. So without further ado, welcome Rodney Wilson.
Hey.
Hey, Rodney.
Hi, thank you both, Stephen and Wendy. I really appreciate the invitation to be with you this evening. It's an honor to get to speak with you. I've seen a few of your shows in the past, so I'm very happy to be part of this one.
Oh, and that's so great. Yeah. You saw a few of our shows and you want to be here. Great.
I didn't scare you away. So Rodney, very serious questions to start. Is your necktie collection as fabulous as it was in the 90s now?
Well, I do still have some of those neckties. However, I don't have to wear one any longer, but they're hanging in my closet. And some of those neckties actually students gave to me. One I have of the Constitution, We the People, that a student gave to me at the end of one year. But yeah, I've got the Mona Lisa still and the Vincent van Gogh. I have them.
A Mona Lisa tie.
I tell you, I mean, it's been one of the joys of watching the documentaries and the Dateline piece. I'm like, I love Rodney's ties. They are amazing.
So, Rodney, I think for a lot of people, everyone wants to know the backstory of somebody like you. So take us back to 1994. Okay, when it all started. Tell us what you were doing, the environment, all of it.
Okay, I was very much a closeted person throughout my upbringing in the 1970s and 80s. Finally, when I was in college, I started the process of coming out. I started going to a Gay and Lesbian Student Alliance group. And then I became a teacher in 1990. And over time, the fear and the anxiety I had about being a gay teacher began to disappear. And I also began to get involved in a lot of various civil rights and LGBT rights movements in St. Louis. And it just became clear to me that eventually this information would leak out. And I felt it was important that it not just leak out by rumor mill and innuendo and gossip, but that I actually take control of that information and I divulge it when it was my time to do so. So in 1994, that would have been my fourth year as a teacher. In Missouri, you become a tenured teacher after your fifth year. So I was in a precarious place being in my fourth year, but it just became very clear to me for many reasons. In addition to the fact that October was about to be the first annual, back then we called it Lesbian and Gay History Month, and I was very much involved in that. And I knew there would be some publicity around it. So in March of 1994, I decided it was time that my students know and that my high school know. It was a suburban high school in St. Louis, had about 115 teachers, a couple thousand students. And we happened at that time to be talking about the World War II and the Holocaust because we were near the end of the semester. So you'd gotten a little farther along in the story. And I had been in Washington, D.C. The week before at an NEA event. And while there, I visited the National Holocaust Museum, and I bought a poster that had various patches that various individuals would have been forced to wear during the time of the Nazi period. And I had that hanging on the chalkboard in my classroom. And I was talking to the students about it. And I said, if I had been alive at that time, the pink triangle would have been the one I would have had to wear because I'm gay, and it wasn't allowed to be gay in Germany, and certainly not in Nazi Germany. So that was the beginning of that coming out process. And as you can imagine, that news spread rather quickly throughout the high school.
And I'm just curious, the news, I'm sure, spread quickly, but your class is sitting there, and, I'm thinking back to the 90s, right? And what the environment, the LGBTQ environment, there wasn't even a Q or a T then, right? So immediately, how did the kids in your class react?
There was a little bit of silence at first as they tried to take in the information. These were juniors, so they were 16, 17 years old in that very first class in which it happened. And they had a piece of paper I had given them with the various patches as well, and they start to look those over, and then they understand what's happening. And in fact, they ended up, by the end of that class period, they ended up with an applause, because it was a very emotional moment for them and for me. It was a revelation of information they did not know or hadn't perhaps suspected. I likened it very much to, if I were Jewish, I might have said, I'm Jewish and therefore, or if I were a Jehovah's Witness, I might have said the purple triangle would be for Jehovah's Witnesses like me. For me, it just happened to be that I'm a gay man. But my students, those I had been with by that point for about 7 or 8 months, so they knew me well, they knew I cared, they knew I wanted the best for them. Their reaction and their response was largely very positive and very warm and very welcoming.
So you really took a chance, and it worked out in your favor. But I watched the piece on Dateline. A lot of the parents weren't so happy about this. What kind of feedback did you get after this?
That's correct. There were parents who were not pleased with what had happened, and there were parents who called administration, and then I was called into the office of the principal and the vice principal to talk about what had happened. It went over to central office. There was a board meeting or 2 or 3 that got rather loud, and some who were rather vocal in condemning what I had done, denouncing what I had done, declaring it inappropriate classroom conduct. And I was always on that precipice, really, about whether or not I would be renewed at the end of that school year. Since I didn't have tenure, I had another year to go to get tenure.
You were risking your tenure.
Absolutely. I mean, just no real protections. I mean, so Rodney, what do you think was kind of the key factor in you getting to that 5th year? I mean,
I think it was a combination of, one, I had an impeccable record. Everyone knew I was a very good teacher. I had very good rapport with students. There was nothing in any of my previous evaluations that was in any way negative. Additionally, 2 other factors. One, the Missouri National Education Association became involved very quickly. They provided me a wonderful attorney, Sally Barker. I'll never forget her name. And 2, it became a matter of public debate. Therefore, I think administration was aware that if they did mistreat me in the end, if they didn't grant me tenure, if they did fire me, they would do so with the spotlight on them. So I think all of those factors combined to make it possible for me to be granted tenure the following year at the end of my 5th year.
Amazing.
Absolutely. So, Rodney, I'm curious. I mean, so you come out to your students, and I'm sure you expected something to happen from this, some after effects. Did you imagine that you would become national news?
No, I did not. Didn't have any idea. And the first person to ever report on the story, her name is Jeanette Batts, and she's a wonderful writer, and she wrote for an alternative newspaper in St. Louis called the Riverfront Times. She and I had a conversation just recently about how is it that she learned what had happened, what was going on. And she doesn't remember, and I don't remember, but somehow she learned of it. She contacted me, And I was willing to do this story with her, knowing that the Riverfront Times was an alternative, progressive paper, and it wouldn't be a slam. So the fact that she covered the story, then that newspaper made its way to a producer at Dateline somehow. I don't recall how or remember how. And then Dateline came in and did their story in October of 1994. So at that point, administration was well aware that what was happening would be covered, and that whatever they decided to do, it would be part of the public record. And in addition, I think they generally did like me. They generally did respect me. They generally did know that I was a good teacher. And that sort of gave them the ultimate backup to do the right thing.
I saw the Dateline piece, and there was a girl and her father interviewed. They were both Christian, and they made a really terrible analogy about, you know, what being gay meant. And I'm curious, did you hear from your students, like say 10 or 15 or 20 years after all this happened? Did any of them reach out to you? Did any of them even come out as gay?
Yes, to all of those questions.
So many.
That particular student has not made any contact with me since.
Of course, yeah.
I would love for her to. I would love to know where she is now and how she evolved and what she thinks now. She was a wonderful student, a great student. So I would like to know where she is. Some students, yes, did come to me later and say they also are gay or lesbian or bisexual, and how meaningful it was to them to have someone in the classroom that they could identify with. And then I have had students too, one in particular I'm thinking about, her name is Sarah, and she was profiled in Taboo Teaching, which is the documentary short about this event. And she was Southern Baptist, as she explains, and she liked me as a teacher. But when this happened, she felt that's it. He's going to hell. There's no redemption here. And she wrote me a letter now probably 8 or 9 years ago. We became Facebook friends, and she apologized for how she felt and what she had written in an end of school year letter to me. Actually, thank goodness I had no memory of it, because I would never take what a 14, 15, or 16-year-old was saying to me that personally, because I know their views and values aren't really formed yet. They're simply reflecting what they've learned from parents or from church or culture. So I hadn't held it against her, didn't even remember it. And funny enough, coincidentally, she is now a teacher in the same high school in the classroom directly across from the one they were in.
Talk about full circle.
I mean, Rodney, so question, because the Melville School that is described in Taboo Teaching, the documentary, seems to be a vastly different environment from the Melville School that was on the Dateline episode. I mean, do you think that what you did played any part in those changes that you might have pushed the school to become more progressive, to be the school that it is today?
I think what happened in 94 to 96 with me was definitely part of that. So I would take, a little bit of credit for that. And you're right. And that's one of the things I like about that documentary the most, is that it now profiles what's happening, that they've got a gay and straight alliance, that they had a transgender student playing on the sports team, that the principal of the school is very supportive, that there's an openly gay teacher there who mentioned his husband when he was applying for the job as theater director, and how his husband would be able to help with the theater work. So it is very different, because when I was there were 12 lesbian and gay teachers, and we knew who we were. We'd get together at Christmas, at somebody's house, but we were quiet about it at work. And none of them had ever come out. None of them came out after I did, even. They were all older. I was sort of the younger teacher in that group of about a dozen. But now I think it's a very different environment. And I think that high school, and thank goodness, not only that high school, but high schools all over the country have really evolved and changed and grown on that issue. And while young people today, of course, still have a lot of challenges, and there's still isolation and there's still suffering that many go through, it is better. It does get better. The Trevor Project, it does get better. All of that is true.
Right. We say that as well. You know, it does get better. I am very curious about your upbringing and how it affected the fact that you have the courage of your convictions. I mean, you laid your personal self on the line. You laid your job on the line, your reputation. And how did you grow up that just made you into the person that you are?
Well, my mother certainly is an individual who's always stood up for herself. She is a strong woman, and she has always defended and protected herself. So I think I get a little bit, or perhaps a lot, of her personality. I also really believe in truth, that we only get one life, and the life that's lived legitimately and truthfully and honestly and forthrightly is better than a life that's lived in shadows or in fear or anxiety. So I think all of that played a role in making me, in 1994, decide I just have to say what's happening here. I have to, the truth does set us free. I think that's the truth right there.
Absolutely. Rodney, I've said this to you before, but I will say it live. You know, I would have been a high school student around 1994, but closer to 97. You know, I'm so young. But to have had a teacher do that, I just think would have been so profoundly meaningful to me. And I mean, and the students and the people at your school, I mean, whether they realize it or not, owe you a great deal of debt. Because I mean, for gay kids, LGBTQ kids everywhere, to have real role models is extremely important, and you put yourself out there as a role model.
Well, and it made you comfortable in your own skin.
I mean, it certainly would have. I mean, you know, and so, yeah.
It's huge, really.
Absolutely.
Think about it. It's huge.
Not to gush all over you, but...
oh, you're gushing. And you had to say how young you are. Oh,
well, any excuse to do that is a good excuse.
We all need to see ourselves in the environment in which we're being raised. It's important to have those models who model behavior and model a happy life. And you're right. And when I was growing up, I started kindergarten in 1970. I finished high school in 83. Believe me, there was no one gay around that I was aware of. There would not have been anyone gay or lesbian knowingly teaching at my high school. I did feel isolated. It was a small town of 2,500 people, about an hour south of St. Louis, nestled in the Missouri Ozarks. And you didn't have gay people. You didn't talk about it. If there were gay people, they would flee to St. Louis as soon as they could. They would leave the town and they'd get out of there, sometimes in the midst of a marriage that was falling apart because of a scandal, and they would go to St. Louis and live a free and open and happy life. But we didn't have that in my school district, certainly in the 70s and into the early 80s. And even now in the small towns across America, you still don't have gay-straight alliances. You still don't have openly gay teachers. So this is something that still, while much more pervasive nationally, has yet to find its way into most of our small towns and villages.
Yeah,
I absolutely agree. I mean, you know, thinking about the Melville School and how progressive it became, rather, I mean, I think about my hometown, which was a little larger than yours, but I don't think the culture's changed that much from what I've learned from other teachers there. So, yeah, I mean, we've still got a ways to go, but
definite ways to go. It's interesting, Rodney, because I grew up in New York City, and you and I are probably on that timeline closer than Stephen and I. But when I grew up, you know, no one really cared a teacher could be gay. The teacher didn't have to come out and say they would. It just wouldn't have entered into anybody's agenda. And certainly my friends, they were just out if they wanted to be out. And there wasn't all this other stuff. When I came here to our Milford, Pennsylvania, initially our organization, we worked with a lot of high school kids. And it was a big eye opener for me, because I'm like, well, what do you mean they feel, ostracized? What do you mean they're being ostracized, being bullied and all of that? We did not have that in New York City. We really didn't. I started to understand. And even now, Rodney, you brought out the point that when you go to small town America, and let's face it, even look at this year, the way things have been going, that is not a good situation in many, many ways.
The good news is they have the internet.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
Via the internet, they're able to connect with all sorts of people, including people who are exactly as they are. When you and I, Wendy, were growing up, you were isolated. You had a landline. You could call someone if you knew anyone. But today, the whole world, thankfully, is at their fingertips, and they can reach out. There are all sorts of groups like yours there in Pennsylvania that they can reach out to. They can get help. And the good news is, when they go away to colleges, unless it's a conservative religious college, and even some of those I would suspect, when they go away from college, almost every college and university has some sort of diversity group, inclusion group, LGBTQ group. So there's where they can certainly begin finding their people and making community and growing comfortable with themselves, which is a lifelong struggle. I've often wondered, if I hadn't had to spend the first 25 years of my life getting comfortable in my own skin, how much differently my life had turned out. What type of obstacles would I have not needed to overcome? What else might I have done? And how much of that remains? We always have a vestige of everything that we've even overcome.
Oh my gosh, that is so true, right?
It's still there. There's still things from time to time, a little piece yet in the brain.
Yeah, right in that little voice. Every now and then, that little voice will just pop up and say that.
Right. And so we have to work through which everyone does. We all have things to work through. We all have things we have to overcome, but some have more than others. And being part of a gender or sexual minority certainly gives you some obstacles you need to overcome that are a little different.
That is the truth. So how did all of this lay the groundwork for LGBTQ History Month?
Great question, because for me, it was by grounding myself in history that I was able to find my place to stand. So it was family history, American history, world history, LGBTQ history, people like me in the past, people who struggled with what I'm struggling with in the past, a story of these people that unfolded, that brought us to the point at which I found myself. So I was so strengthened by the study of all history, women's history, Black history, LGBTQ history. It just placed me in my time and in my place. I wasn't just dropped down here. There was a whole history of humanity that came before me. And when that energized me, and when that gave me grounding, and when that gave me a foundation from which to live my life, I recognized I want to help do the same thing for other people. And Carter Woodson, of course, the father of Black history, the founder of African American History Month, originally Negro History Week in 1926, he did the same thing because he believed that the history of Black people in America had been forgotten, and it had been overlooked, and it had been. It wasn't there. He found strength in that history. And so he started the study of Negro life in America. He started Negro History Week, which becomes Black History Month, African American History Month. Women did the same thing. Hispanic Americans, Latinx did the same thing. Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders did the same thing. And then in 1994, January, I took a seat and proposed that we say we want, then called Lesbian and Gay History Month. I picked October because the first March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights was in October of '79. The second one was in October of '87. Of course, you have Coming Out Day. It was within the academic calendar year. So June, July wouldn't work. August, the first month of school, wouldn't work. You had to find the right place for it.
Right, timing is everything, they say.
Timing is everything, and it was still free. No other group had claimed, that month. So I decided October would be a good time to do it. I sent that information out to every LGBT group I could think of course, via postal mail. I didn't even have email in January. Snail mail. And immediately, various people decided they wanted to help. My friend Jonda from college, who had been president of the lesbian and gay group on campus, she was the first person to help me. And then Kevin Booyer, who ran the Gerber Hart Lesbian and Gay Archive and Library in Chicago, he jumped in. Kevin Jennings, who had founded GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network in Massachusetts, he jumped in. They brought both of their institutions. We formed a founding board. 3 or 4 other people were involved. Tori Wilson, Jasiah Greenman, Sarah Lynn Chestnut. And we said, this exists. Here's what we're going to do. Here's a packet. Send us $5. We'll give you a packet of material to do this October. And from that point forward, this is now the 27th annual. But the purpose is to help other people ground themselves in the story, ground themselves in the people who came before them, who had similar struggles that they do, and therefore find empowerment.
So you go first.
So I was just going to ask, because as you said, this information wasn't widely out there in the 90s. And I think for a lot of people, people might be stumped as to where to learn this history. Yeah. So where can someone go to learn more about LGBTQ history?
A lot of books out there now. Authors like Eric Marcus come to mind. A lot of websites out there now. LGBTHistoryMonth.com is one. So there's so many places now that you can go. Kevin Jennings, I mentioned him a second ago. He has a great book that he published in the early 90s where he looks at documents in American history and finds those and people who were LGBT in American history. It's actually it's called Becoming Visible, and it was written for high school age students. So there's so much information out there now, so much that's available. It's really a wealth of information.
Rodney, I'd like to get your opinion on something. There is a group I work with, a writing group called Generations, and their goal is to bridge what they see is a huge gap between younger gays and older gays. And I have heard this from a lot of my friends that the younger kids, because their struggle is not nearly as hard, they do not appreciate the groundwork that was laid out by, people like back in the 90s. So I'm curious what your experience as a teacher is with that right now. What are you finding?
It is very hard for young people who have their entire life story ahead of them to be developmentally even ready to study what happened 100 years ago and 200 years ago. So that's an issue right there. But secondly, I think it is important, and that's why we have history classes. It is important that we pass on the stories, that we share the story. And the Generations Project that you're part of, I've heard of it. I think it's excellent. I think it's doing
fantastic. I've been doing their classes, the workshops online, but they came about when I asked them, why do you call it Generations Project? What made you do this? And they talk about this big gap between, people in their 20s and people in their 50s. And to pick up on what you said, you jumped into history, okay? Finding history, LGBTQ history of the people that came before. What came before was very important to you. But out there in the world, how do we put a value on that in the current LGBTQ world of people that are in their 20s?
I think we're all trying to do that. That's part of what we're doing right now with this conversation. We're trying to do that. We're trying to put a spotlight on what happened before. I think it's really, really important that all of our textbooks that are used in our high schools include LGBTQ history.
That's a biggie that you just hit on, right?
Amen.
It's essential. I think that it's important that our high schools and colleges celebrate Black History Month, Women's History Month, LGBTQ History Month. That helps young people become more cognizant or conscious or aware of the fact that there is a backstory to their lives and to our civilization. I think it's important that when curriculum committees meet in various state departments of education, that they make certain included in the curriculum is information about the history of all people. That can get very difficult to do, especially in a state, for example, like Texas, that has so much control over what goes into our textbooks because it's a huge textbook market. But, you know, some states are beginning, like Illinois recently, they're beginning to say in their state departments of education, we have to include LGBTQ history when we teach history, American history, to our students. So all of those are ways in which we begin to remember these stories and to pass these stories on to the generation that will follow us.
Yeah, now more than ever, really, because one of the things you brought up, the Holocaust film, you know, and I'm sure, you know, there are people trying to erase what happened during the Holocaust. That was a great example, by the way. I did not realize that somebody who was gay at that time had to wear a pink armband. I didn't know that till you said that, right? And I'm half Jewish. I should know that. Why do I not know that? So if we don't all get together and exchange this kind of information, all right, whether through conversation or film or through literature and teaching and all of that, I think it's all of our responsibility, everybody here tonight.
Right. We all move on. We move on in our lives and we move on as a nation. And World War II ended, 75 years ago now. Everyone from that generation who was conscious enough to know what was going on, they will soon all be gone. They won't be here anymore. Steven Spielberg, as you know, perhaps is doing a terrific project in preserving these stories of people who were Holocaust survivors. So we've got film now, we've got audio. We do have a way to keep these people and their memories alive in the way we didn't have even 75 or 80 years ago. So it's vital that we do that with all people groups, with everyone, with the stories of all ethnicities, of all genders and sexualities, that we remember that information, that we get it in an archive somewhere so that it's preserved and it's protected and it's there for the future.
Yep.
Absolutely.
I totally agree. Do you want to take some questions?
Should we take some questions? Okay. Let me scroll. So one of our good friends and excellent artist, James McIsaac.
He's a wonderful artist,
yes,
and a terrific person.
Let's see. I'm really leaning down. So the first question, if you didn't announce you were gay, wouldn't it have been worse if you were noticed as an activist?
Oh, that's a good question, right?
Yes, absolutely. That is a good question. And that's one of the primary reasons I decided I had to control the information. I had to control the story because I was getting more and more involved at this point in my life already. For example, before I came out, I had written a letter to the editor of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch about, believe it or not, marriage equality. And this was long before that was.
Wow.
You were ahead of your time.
Yes, you were.
And that came out in the school. Somebody clipped it out. It began to pass around. One person, one teacher in the front office, a man actually got down on his knee to propose to another man, making fun of what I had written. So the information was beginning to seep out. And I think you keep your power when you determine when to tell your story. And if you know that story is about to come out, you go ahead and release it.
Absolutely.
So just while you look for another question, so I have a question about that along those lines. Why did, obviously you had been contemplating when you were going to come out to your class, right? Why did you choose to do it through presenting a film on the Holocaust?
I don't recall actually how conscious that choice was. It's that
choice.
It was a choice. And I don't know if I even knew that that would happen when those students walked into the classroom. I knew it could happen. I knew I had the poster from the Holocaust Museum from the week prior. I knew we were finishing up this film, Escape from Sobibor. I knew we were going to have a discussion about it. I knew it was a possibility, maybe even a high possibility. But until it happened, I could not have said to you, it will happen today.
Wow. Amazing. Very impactful. Very impactful.
So a next question by James would you have been so confident to come out at work if you didn't have allies and other teachers? And kind of second question, were they worried about being discovered by supporting you?
Yes, having other teachers in the building who were in a similar situation was definitely very helpful. And yes, some of them did back away from me a little bit after I came out because they had been working there a long time and their story hadn't become public. And there was a little bit of that. Some of them, though, remained very supportive and very close and went to bat with me and went into meetings as the representative of the local union, the MCTA, with me when I would meet with the principal or the vice principal. But there were some who I think did have anxiety that I could bring that whole thing down. Of course, I made it clear to them, I'm not in the outing business. I would never out anyone. That's a personal decision, but there was some anxiety about that. One of the other things I did that helped me was that summer of 1994, I founded GLSEN St. Louis. You know, Kevin Jennings started the national movement in Massachusetts, and St. Louis was the first chapter outside of Massachusetts. And I did that specifically, one, to help other teachers, but two, because I needed help. I needed support. I needed other teachers from the St. Louis City, St. Louis County, and the metro area. We'd come together once a month beginning in that summer of 1994 so that I knew I would have a support network throughout school year 94-95, whatever happened.
That's incredible. Yeah. And then let me make sure yes, there is a question here. So I will read the entire post. This is again from James. He says, I am the same age as you. Back in the 70s, I don't remember studies on the Holocaust. A gloss over on World War II. I was in Catholic school. That might be the reason. Yeah. Was it being taught in detail as part of the schooling syllabus in the 90s? Has it been a requirement to teach the history of the Holocaust?
Yes, it is absolutely part of the curriculum now in high schools everywhere. I think in part that happened because we recognized we were getting beyond that historical event and that people were dying out, and there were some beginning to question some of the particulars without any foundation to do so, of course. And so it became nationally something we wanted to emphasize. And it's a requirement, I would suspect, in every American History 2 or American History post-Civil War class now, that you make it through World War II and you emphasize the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank goodness. I mean, I like I say, when I was in class in the 90s, we certainly learned about the Holocaust. I mean, I didn't learn about the pink triangle, mind you, until I was in college. So,
right. And I didn't learn about the pink triangle at all till I heard you speak about it. So there you go. I mean, I think you've really brought out, we're always learning about history. We have to keep our minds open and think how history can affect us now, because there is some truth in history repeating itself.
Oh, absolutely.
Although with what's going on like now between the pandemic and everything else, I'm not sure what's repeating anything anymore. Some days I wake up and I'm like, I'm in a Mad Max film. I do. I actually feel that way sometimes. And you walk out on the street and people are wearing masks. Certainly in New York City, really, it's a populated city. Everybody's got masks. Little children have masks on, and you say to yourself, you start to think, and historically, and I've been saying this, how did we come to this?
It's a great question, because 2020 has been an awful year. We knew it would be a rough year because of the presidential election. That's always rough. We knew this one would be particularly rough presidential election, but we had no idea. I've read some of their comments that we've got a little bit here of the 1850s in terms of civil instability and aggravation with one another and strife and disunity that led into the Civil War in 1861. We've got a little bit of the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic. We've got a little bit of the Great Depression or Great Recession because of economic problems and the unemployment that's so high. And of course, we've got some of 1968, which was a very volatile year with assassinations and presidents not running for re-election. So it's almost all been thrown at us in 2020. And I think all of us have our fingers crossed that in 2021, we'll have a safe and effective vaccine against the virus so we can move on. And we have a rational, reasonable, decent human being living in the White House.
Couldn't have said it better, Rodney. But I think we just got another question in too.
I think we got a couple. Here's a good one. How did your family react when you came out? Did you end up on the B list, i.e. banished? I ask as my wife is transgender and we were banished.
I'm so sorry to hear that. And that's a sad thing. In 2020, people are still banished. People are still given B status in their own families that are supposed to be about unconditional love. The good news in my family is that we did not have a firm religious upbringing. I myself was quite religious by nature, but my parents weren't. So I didn't get things, beaten into my head about religion. I think that helped. My mother, when I told her when I was 26 years old, she said, "Son, I've known for years." That was her first word. That's an exact quote. And she was fine within 24 hours. My dad had a little bit more of a struggle and took him a little bit of time, but within 6 months or so, he was okay. My sister was okay about the issue as well, and she raised her children to be okay about having a gay uncle. So in that respect, I'm very lucky and very fortunate. Now, I come from a large family. My mother was one of 18 and my father was one of 13. Wow. So I have tons of aunts and uncles and cousins.
Oh my God.
God, Christmas must be a nightmare for you. You must go broke, Rodney.
It's a lot. And so some of them are not accepting, and some I've had to cut ties with some of them over this issue or over other issues. But my immediate family, my one remaining grandparent who was alive in the 1990s, she died in 1994 actually, I let her know that I'm gay, and her comment was, "Well, I thought you just always liked to read books."
That's genius.
Yeah.
That's great.
But she was fine after that. So I think overall I've been very lucky and very fortunate.
Totally.
Rodney, one question I was going to ask, since the topic of religion came up, because in one of the articles it's about you, you said in the article that a gay person has to come out to God in a sense when they, are kind of expressing their truth. Can you kind of explain what you mean by that? And
yeah, I was born with a religious orientation. It's just been part of who I was. I was interested in religion from early in my life. I'd walk down to the local Baptist church on my own. I was never in a religious building with my parents until I was 16 when I took them. So it was just something about who I was. And it was also a lot of fear involved, because even though back then, I don't think the churches in the 70s were as harsh and mean on the issue, maybe because it wasn't even in our consciousness yet that people could be gay, and so they didn't feel they needed to talk about it. But I still had anxiety about it. I'd look up in the index the word homosexual in the Bible to see what it had to say, or in the dictionary to see what it had to say. And I can remember also praying every night, and this is the prayer I haven't memorized because I said it 1,000 times: God, help me like girls and not boys. God never intervened. I, at this point in my life, don't believe in an interventionist God who's involved in the world, who does intervene, certainly not to make somebody like girls and not boys just because he's a boy. But yeah, you have to come out to God. And that whole evolution of my religiosity, is another complete story, because I was deeply involved. I was a conservative fundamentalist Christian, and I believed every word in the Bible. And I read Hal Lindsey's Late Great Planet Earth in 1980. It came out in 1970, and I was sure the rapture was happening any moment, and tribulation. And, I was a true believer in that branch of Christianity that now I find so morally bankrupt. So that's also been a story in the evolution of coming out, accepting who I am, and then reevaluating my religious beliefs.
So your coming out actually was the deal breaker for this religion that you had so strongly identified with. Really, a fundamental Christian is, that's pretty far in one direction. You identified with it, and yet when you came to your own truth about coming out, that wasn't working for you anymore, the Christianity.
That's right, because I knew that I was okay, and that at that time I would have said God is okay with me. So I moved from a conservative Christian experience to a moderate Christian experience to a liberal Christian experience to now where I think Jesus is great. I think the teachings are awesome, but I'm very agnostic about the details of religious questions. I am a spiritual person. I still like to hear a gospel song here and there. Amy Grant is still my favorite singer.
I love Amy Grant.
Yeah. Oh, she's the soundtrack of my life. I got her first album.
That's so funny. Amy Grant is the soundtrack of my life.
Really? I got her first album in 1982, Age to Age, and I've had every one ever since, almost 40 years.
I was born in 82.
You could have collected. You could have collected the album. It should be in your album collection.
So I'm still a spiritual person, but in regard to dogmas and doctrines and details, I'm agnostic, and I'm terribly hurt and disappointed right now at American Republican, largely white Christianity.
In the direction.
The embrace of Donald Trump. 81% of white evangelical Christians who voted for Trump in 2016. I will never understand how they have fallen for this golden calf, this con man who doesn't in any way exemplify character or ethics or values or morality or even common decency. So I am very hurt, really, and troubled, deeply troubled by how white evangelical Christianity and Donald Trump have gone to bed together.
Well, I think that's not a question for a lot of us, but take heart, because on our show we've had a number of people from the clergy and who they've just been terrific. And I've talked about how God loves everybody equally.
Absolutely.
And they are in their own churches making a movement towards that, which is great. As you know, things are always changing and evolving, and there's incredible people out there doing the right thing, doing really what should be Christian values, right? Love. It should be love at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
Love is the most important thing. Love one another.
Right.
God is love. That's the most important thing.
Yeah.
And in our record, there are always setbacks. You might remember on election night 2016, Van Jones talked about on CNN a white lash, a white backlash. We've had this so many times before. After Reconstruction, after the Civil War, when the Freedmen's Bureau tried to do good things, and then we had that white lash, which was almost 100 years of Jim Crow segregation, racism, rise of the Klan. And then we were happily moving along. We were making great progress. And then in 2016, we had this white lash, as Van Jones called it, or this backlash against the progress we had been making. And now we're dealing with that. And everything potentially is on the line November 3rd. Can we get back to a semblance of normalcy, or will we continue down this path that's a very scary one to be on?
Absolutely scary, and we will find out on November 3rd, as scared as that is for me to think about.
Stay tuned.
Rodney, one more question from Scott G. Shelp. What do we do about people whose religion is a barrier to accepting LGBTQ people?
Well, I'll let you know. Scott Shelp is a friend of mine. I didn't know he was going to be on here.
Hi, Scott. Hi. Thanks for tuning in.
We met in college 30 years ago. He lives in San Francisco now, and he was a very brave person 30 years ago, went on the local television station in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, which is the hometown of the Limbaugh family, including Rush Limbaugh. So as you can imagine, it's a very conservative place, and he was brave as, I guess, a 20-year-old to go on TV and talk about it. I think that we do our best to try to help people who have a religious doctrine that prevents them from believing that LGBTQ people are equal under law and equal under heaven. It prevents them from believing that. We try our darndest to help them understand that that's not the case. But I have to say, religious views are hard to break, and it's hard to change a religious doctrine. It's hard to let go of what you've been taught in creeds and doctrines. So sometimes for our own sanity and well-being, we just have to, walk away. Not every friend is a friend for life. Not every family member is a friend. So we have to find those who really are the good friends. Make our own family sometimes, but we might have to walk away from them. It's sad. I have a cousin right now I love, but we don't have a relationship. And it's largely two reasons. One, her views on homosexuality that are informed by her religion, and now to her support of Trump. So sometimes you have to let go. Hopefully, if we get through this in November and we move on into a more normal way of life, hopefully we can slowly begin to put down the barriers, slowly begin to reconcile, but only time will tell.
Only time will tell, and we're all here for a normal way of life, really, going forward.
Absolutely. Wendy and I went to a performance last night, and the MC, who is a board member of our organization, Miss Bell Pepper,
yes,
did a number about building bridges. And I hope that as time moves on, we can build those bridges back. I think they're probably in bad shape right now, but that doesn't mean they can't be repaired. And honestly, Rodney, the work you do and what you have done in the past is key to helping us build these bridges, knowing our history and being out there and expressing who you are and your truth. I mean, it's very important to ultimately bring us back together.
Which is what we're all hoping for.
Yeah. Reconciliation is such a beautiful thing. Grace, reconciliation.
Right.
You might remember when the apartheid regime collapsed in South Africa, had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission,
Mm-hmm.
so they could deal with. See, that's something we've really not had in the United States. We tried that a bit in Reconstruction, but then we put it away, and we did it a bit in the Civil Rights Movement, 50s through the early 70s, and then we put it away. And now with the Black Lives Matter movement, we are again trying to engage in truth and reconciliation movement. And it's very hard to do. And it's a very complex endeavor. But I really think there's love and peace when you get to the other side, when you get through reconciliation and you get through forgiveness and you move to the other side.
And that's what all of us want. We all want to move to the other side, and we all want to just move forward, build those bridges. And you said it earlier, it's all about love and trust. You've been such a great, my God, you are a historian and a half. I could sit and pick your brain forever.
Amen to that.
Brain picking.
This has been wonderful, Rodney. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Well, I appreciate what you do. I appreciate John Palmadessa, who's a Facebook friend of mine, who was on your show.
He's an amazing member in the community.
I appreciate that he mentioned me to you, and then you contacted me. But yeah, this has been a real privilege to have this conversation with you and with your audience, and I'm very thankful.
And thank you to our audience who tuned in, everyone who asked questions. We love your support, and we want to share everything that's happening on the screen with you. So thank you.
Absolutely. So thank you, everyone, and good night, and we will see you next week.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.